Anyway, first of all, signs and wonders cannot and do not, quote, prove a thing. This is a very low tier, low information voters who believe that a mere sign or wonder necessarily proves the entire paradigm or system. In Luke 16, we have the statement, "A wicked and adulterous generation seeks signs, and yet no sign is given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." In other words, Jesus refers back to already written divine revelation, the book of Jonah, to show that you're asking me to do signs and wonders to, quote, prove my ministry, even though he already did do signs and wonders as an attestation and, in a limited sense, a, quote, proof of his ministry. It's not a proof in the strict sense of paradigm level justification, because if we think about atheists, for example, you'll notice a lot of very low tier normie apologetics tries to prove the possibility of a resurrection to an atheist. Look at all the witnesses. Look at the change in their lives. Well, that may be the case, but it's conceivable that people can change their lives and die for something false. Even Christians across the board, so-called, in various groups and sects, will admit that people can die for a false belief or a heresy. For example, we have the statement in Cantate Domino, the Council of Florence, that the Roman Catholic Church formally dogmatized the position that even if a person dies for the name of Christ outside of communion with the papacy, they're still lost. So even if you're a Roman Catholic, you would have to admit that just because a person is martyred or does some heroic action, like dying for the name of Christ, it still doesn't prove that the religion is true, especially given every religion claims signs and wonders. And, as I pointed out many times, there were thousands and thousands of people who supposedly witnessed Mary appear at a Coptic church in Zaytun, Egypt. Does that mean that Coptic theology is true because supposedly Mary appeared to many people? And so we begin to see that very, very quickly, thinking that a miracle claim proves the entire paradigm is easily demonstrably false, because the same criteria is not used when other religions and paradigms claim the same. For example, you heard probably a few weeks ago, we had a Roman Catholic that, maybe a couple months ago, called in and debated me twice on this topic for about an hour each time. And every time I would bring up the counter objections, he would move the goalpost to say, well, the Roman Catholic miracles have been scientifically proven. Okay, well, what happens when a Coptic person claims that the Coptic apparition is scientifically proven? It's a never-ending chain of regression of miracle claims. For example, we had some years back Muslims for many years claiming the miracles of the Quran prove the Quran. Now, I don't believe that there were real miracles of the Quran, but my point is that you're never going to solve a paradigm level challenge by elements or particular things within the worldview itself. Because just like an atheist is not going to accept the claims that Jesus rose from the dead on the basis of so-called eyewitnesses or this or that person or this or that theologian, they're going to reinterpret it according to the lens that they have, their paradigm, their rose-colored glasses. They're going to say, perhaps it appeared to them that Jesus walked out of the tomb, and perhaps this and that. Perhaps it was a yet unexplained natural event. Perhaps it was another person. Perhaps it was this, that. So in other words, again, as we've pointed out many years, many hundred times, there's nothing about the issues that we're talking about that are strictly evidential in nature. They're not evidential problems. Like if you just stack up enough, quote, evidences, suddenly it becomes true or the entire paradigm is true. Even if Jesus was raised from the dead or came back from the dead, how do we know that that proves anything outside of the assumptions of the rest of the paradigm of Christianity? We have in the Old Testament many holy men, some of whom came back and appeared and did resurrections and so forth, the bones of Elisha, right? But in other words, the resurrection of Christ only has the meaning that it has within the entire Christian redemptive story. So just rising from the dead itself even doesn't necessarily mean that the totality of Christianity is true, even if you were to somehow convince a person that it was very likely that Jesus rose from the dead. So these are all logical refutations and objections to the claim that supposedly this event means the entire paradigm is true. Now, I do believe that the paradigm is true, but I'm trying to make a different philosophical point that seems to go over so many people's heads who can't think in terms of systems. They can only think in terms of particular piecemeal bits and pieces. Same problem that we see, for example, with papists when they try to argue for the papacy. They don't understand that all I need is one dogmatic contradiction between various popes.
I didn't see your Bible. It's not
It might be in your car. It might have been slid back in there. It's not a big deal. I didn't leave it at church. It's there. Well, maybe I did leave it at church. I don't know. Anyway, miracles will accompany the true faith, but miracles themselves and signs and wonders cannot of themselves prove it. And just like in Luke 16, Jesus isn't interested in giving the Pharisees a sign or a wonder. He just simply says, go read Jonah. Remember the story of the rich man, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and the rich guy is in Hades, and he says, "Let me go back from the dead, and the miracle will prove to my brothers that you're the Messiah, and I'll convince them." And Jesus says, "What? Yes, you're right. If we just stack up the evidences, we'll convince everybody." Is that what Jesus says? No, he says, even if one rise from the dead, they still will not believe because they have Moses and the prophets. They already have the story of Jonah and the prophetic typology in Jonah, or the prophetic typology throughout the writings of Moses. If they're not going to believe those prophecies, they will not believe though one rise from the dead. Hello? Is that right? Sound familiar? But Roman Catholics literally argue like the guy, and charismatics, like the guy in Hades. No, but if they just see a miracle, they'll believe. And the point is that people's disbelief isn't ultimately a lack of evidence. It's actually ultimately an issue of the heart and pride and hard-heartedness. Now, intellect is involved because a hard heart will misuse the intellect and the reasoning faculty to go against divine revelation, go against God, go against what's true. And they will selectively pick and choose the evidences that they accept. That's why evidentialism doesn't work. In fact, if you read C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, that's the entire point of the character of Mark in the third installment. Mark knew deep down from the beginning of joining NICE, N-I-C-E, which is basically the NWO and the Tavistock Institute. He knew that they were evil from the get-go, but he selectively chose the pieces of evidence that fit what he wanted to be the case. This is the whole point of that character in the novel. And when he eventually converts and comes to his senses and realizes that he was part of an evil institution, he admits to himself, you know what? It wasn't because of lack of evidence that it was an evil institution. It was because I didn't want it to be, and I selectively chose the evidence to fit the narrative that I wanted to be the case. He read the evidences with rose-colored glasses. And every atheist, every debunker will do that same thing because it's a issue of paradigms. It's not an issue of a lack of facts or a lack of evidences, because if you were to go into looking into the facts and the evidences, you would begin to see, oh, actually there's tons and tons of evidences, right? And being against evidentialism does not mean I'm against evidences. You have to use evidences. Evidences are absolutely necessary when it comes to, historic Christianity, when it comes to, claims of, Tacitus and claims of Josephus, right? All of these ancient historical texts are very useful as evidences, but that's not the same thing as evidentialism, which presupposes a very naive, enlightenment-ish epistemology that you just present the facts. Humans are neutral observers. The facts are just brute facts. They don't require any interpretation. They're not theory laden. And if you just look at the facts and stack them up, then there it is, right? It's the same naive way that Protestants approach reading the scriptures. Well, the scriptures are just perspicuous. They have perspicacity. They're just clear. And you just go to the clear passages, and the clear passages enlighten the other passages because the Bible is self-attesting and it's clear. Well, maybe some passages are, but that doesn't tell you what the meaning of the non-clear passages are. And how do you know which ones are the clear and which ones aren't? In other words, you cannot avoid theory-laden interpretations of the data and the facts in the world and history and ancient testimonies. Likewise, you can't avoid theory-laden interpretation of language and words and